Well, thank you once again for joining us. Welcome to Grace. We're getting underway this morning, another lesson. But as we begin our study today, in our journey through the Bible, we've come to the closing part of 1 Samuel. We thought we were there last week, but not quite. There's some things I want to cover this week before we jump into 2 Samuel. And so we'll then be in the 10th book of the Bible, 2 Samuel. The book of 1 Samuel gave us the story of King David's training. As God was educating David in the meaning of his name and of David's need to call upon God's name and to rely upon God to exercise his name on David's behalf graciously. So throughout 1 Samuel, we watched God demonstrate the power resident in his name as he delivered David time and time again from the hand of his father-in-law Saul, who was bent on nothing less than killing David. By putting his name into action on David's behalf, David learned to stop relying upon self and to begin relying solely upon the Most High God. So David was learning the necessity of being steadfast in his faith. This is what 1 Samuel is all about. It's his education process. And that education began when he slew the giant Goliath. It actually began before that as the Lord was with David and he slew the animals that were after his father's sheep. God was not about to abandon David in spite of his many failures. We've been seeing some of those because God chose David not based upon his behavior, but based upon what God foreknew about David's belief. David was a man who took God at his word. He was a man who believed God. So let's pick up the story of David's training where we left off in our previous session. There's some things that we want to cover here that I think are important. We'd not covered, as some of you will recall, the final 3 attempts that Saul made on David's life. And we need to take a closer look at those before we move on. You'll recall that in Saul's desire to maintain his control over the nation Israel, not letting go of that seat of power that he had as Israel's king, hanging on to that position because of the praise that he felt himself to be worthy of in that position, he developed an intense fear, actually a bitterness and a fear, a hatred and a fear of David. Samuel told Saul early on that God had rent the kingdom from his hand. It no longer belonged to Saul, and that God had chosen to give the kingdom to a neighbor of Saul's that was better than Saul. And that began to play on Saul's mind, as you recall. As time went along, Saul became increasingly aware that David was the man that God had in mind. And rather than acknowledging what God was doing through David and appreciating David's rightful position as king, seeing David as king, Saul became more and more fearful of David, not wanting to lose the power and the position that he held. So along with that fear came Saul's rage and his intense desire to do away with the one he considered enemy number 1. Now let's go back to our listing of the various attempts that Saul made upon David's life. I left 3 off last week. We didn't get to those 3, but we are going to cover them today. 14 attempts in all. And perhaps there's a significance to that number. We began to examine it in our previous lesson. We've already looked at the first 11 times that Saul tried to end David's life. Today we'll cover the final 3 attempts. The wilderness of Maon, the wilderness of En-Gedi, and the wilderness of Ziph. That'll take us up to Saul's death and prepare us for the book of 2 Samuel where we'll see David's inauguration. So David's education in 1 Samuel, David's graduation as we come to the end of Samuel, the 1 Samuel, and now David's inauguration will begin when we get to 2 Samuel. In order to help us get our bearings on David's location, let's take another look at David's flight from Saul map. I have upgraded it since then, but for today, you'll see everything you need to see there. For those watching live, follow the green arrow, and you'll see the various places to which David fled. You recall that he first went to meet Samuel in Ramah, but thinking that Saul might be hot on his heels, David left Ramah and he went to see son Jonathan, Saul's son, to see if Jonathan knew his father's state of mind. Paul was just checking it out to see if Saul was still after him. When informed by Jonathan, his great friend, that his father was indeed out to kill him, David fled to Nob. This is where he encountered the high priest Ahimelech and told his lies about a supposed mission, secret mission that Saul had sent him on. He had been commissioned by the king, is what he told Ahimelech. So after asking Ahimelech for the showbread and receiving Goliath's sword, David made a hasty exit from Nob because he was sure that Doeg, one of Saul's employees, had overheard his words to the high priest Ahimelech and would take David's whereabouts back to the king, which is exactly what happened later on. Doeg did just that because upon Saul's arrival at Nob, he had all the priests as well as all the people of that city slain by the sword. So you recall these things. From Nob, as you can see on the map, David journeyed on to Gath, the city that had been the former residence of that giant Goliath that David had slain early on. The only way that David could escape the king of Gath was to feign madness, after which he fled to the cave at Adullam. Now, after the cave at Adullam, the Lord told David to go and rescue the people of Keilah from the hands of the Philistines. You can see Keilah, I don't think it's on this one. We'll show it to you next time. But he went to Keilah to rescue the people of Keilah from the Philistines. And as proof that God was working on behalf of the king that he had chosen, David was given a great victory over the Philistines, God continually exercising his name on David's behalf. After which, David asked the Lord if Saul was going to come there to seek him. The Lord said he will come down. You recall that. Then David asked the Lord if the men of Keilah would deliver him and his men into the hands of Saul. The Lord said, they will deliver thee up. This is where we were given an excellent illustration of God's foreknowledge of all things, meaning all things real, meaning experiential, and all things potential, meaning that which would come to pass if the opportunity presented itself. Armed with the knowledge of God's foreknowledge of what Saul would do, David didn't hang around long enough for Saul to actually do it. David fled from Keilah as fast as his feet could carry him. And when Saul heard that he was gone, Saul didn't even bother to go to Keilah. He knew David had already fled. This is where we left off in our previous session. Saul was not about to go away. He was on the constant lookout for David's whereabouts. Now, the next place we find David is in the wilderness of Maon, is actually the proper pronunciation. It looks like Macon without the C there, but you can see it on our listing there of Saul's attempts on David's life. This would make attempt number 12, and it occurs in 1 Samuel chapter 23, where we find a group of people called the Ziphites entering into an agreement with Saul to help Saul find and kill his son-in-law. Who were the Ziphites? Well, the Ziphites were David's countrymen. They were the inhabitants of Ziph, located in Judah, who were willing and ready to betray David, which is exactly what they did. And they were doing that, I'm sure, to gain Saul's favor as the king of Israel. So we see the plan of these folks at Ziph taking shape in chapter 23, beginning with verse 24. Let's quickly move there. And they arose, verse 24 states, and went to Ziph before Saul. But David and his men were in the wilderness of Maon, in the plain of the south of Jeshimon. Saul also and his men went to seek David. And they told David, wherefore he came down into a rock and abode in the wilderness of Maon. And when Saul heard that, he pursued after David in the wilderness of Maon. So Saul's hot on his trail here. Verse 26, and Saul went on this side of the mountain, and David and his men on that side of the mountain. And David made haste to get away for fear of Saul. For Saul and his men compassed David and his men round about to take them. So they're encircling Saul here. We're going to see this later on. It's an important point that they had him compassed about. And we'll show you why a little later, as I said. Now, to give you some insight into David's thoughts when this was taking place, we have only to look at Psalm 54. Which David actually wrote concerning this very event. David wrote Psalm 54 referring to what was happening to him here. Look with me at this psalm for a moment and you'll see what I'm talking about. Notice the words of introduction that appear in our Bible right above verse 1. Now this psalm reveals David's mindset when the Ziphites were conspiring with Saul to help track David down. Here it is. To the chief musician, and in our Bible it's labeled 0. That's a rare event, but it's labeled 0 because this introduces the psalm. To the chief musician on Neganoth, Maskil, a psalm of David, we know he was the author, when the Ziphims, this is a direct reference to the Ziphites who were conspiring with Saul to kill David. When they came and said to Saul, doth not David hide himself with us? So they told Saul that David was in the wilderness of Ziph. They were giving his whereabouts away. Apparently, they were doing everything they could to get in good with the king and have him really beholden to them. It would be interesting to know what the Ziphites hoped to gain from ratting David out, so to speak. We're not told that. However, we are told that David was thinking during this frightful ordeal certain thoughts, and we're told those thoughts. His thoughts are recorded for us beginning in verse 1 of this Psalm 54. Save me, O God. Save me, O God, by thy, what does it say? By thy name. You see the whole issue here that we've been following all through the book, all through the Bible? Save me, O God, by thy name, and judge me by thy strength, not mine, but by thy strength. Hear my prayer, O God. Give ear to the words of my mouth. For strangers are risen up against me, and oppressors seek after my soul. They have not set God before them. Selah, that's the Hebrew word which means a pause, because this is actually written as a psalm here. Now, do you see why I call this part of our study of 1 Samuel David's graduation? His education, now he's beginning to work toward that diploma here. Notice how David was acknowledging God's ability to exercise his name on David's behalf and to do so graciously. This is why God allowed David to undergo what he was undergoing there from the beginning of his affiliation with Saul. It's all about his education. Does it not go right back to the education God was not only giving to his nation, but also to Israel's rightful king, the king that he had Samuel anoint early on, King David? And it's about the meaning of God's name. God had known all along that David would come to that point where he would call upon him and trust in his name. And we can see David going that direction very quickly here. Let's read a bit more of David's thoughts at Maon during the time of Saul's pursuing there. Verse 4 continues the idea in that psalm. Behold, God is mine helper. The Lord is with them that uphold my soul. He shall reward evil, not moral evil, but the Hebrew ra, meaning distress, unto mine enemies. He's going to distress my enemies. Cut them off in thy truth. I will freely sacrifice unto thee. I will praise thy name. Here it is again, O Lord, for it, thy name, is good. For he hath delivered me out of all trouble, and mine eye hath seen his desire upon mine enemies. So it's all about God's name again. Saul's forces did indeed find David at Maon. And the passage tells us that they had David and his forces surrounded. David had a force of about 400 men. Surely Saul thought that his day to kill David had finally arrived. My time has come. I can get this guy. I've got him right where I want him, and I can kill him. At this point, he had as much as had David in the palm of his hands. Did the Lord exercise the power resident in his name on behalf of Israel's rightful king, who was praying, save me by thy name? According to David's own recollection of this event in Psalms 54, well, certainly he did. God delivered David without David having to harm a hair on old King Saul's head. So David was able to escape. Now, just when Saul had David in his sights, it was as though Saul's cell phone rang, in a sense. Notice what he heard on the other end in verse 27. But there came a messenger unto Saul, saying, Haste thee and come, for the Philistines have invaded the land. Wherefore Saul returned from pursuing after David, and he went against the Philistines. Therefore they call that place Selah-Hamelekath, meaning the rock of the divisions. Fortunately for David, Saul took that call when it came in, God having caused his phone to ring in the first place, because Saul had to turn his focus away from David. He had him right there in his sights. He had to train his thoughts somewhere else, and he had to give up on that pursuit and move elsewhere. You see, the Philistines, who were taking occasion by the absence of Saul and his forces from their homeland, used that opportunity to attack Israel. In order to protect his own possessions, Saul and his men had to leave David and head for home, allowing David to flee once again. So Saul had failed at Maon in his 12th attempt to kill the one he perceived to be his archenemy, his son-in-law David. Now, with all his failed attempts to capture and kill David, you'd think that Saul would have known very clearly that God was with David, especially in light of the fact that back in chapter 18, verse 28, it says, And Saul saw and knew that the Lord was with David. So it wasn't any secret to Saul. He knew that the Lord was working on David's behalf. Saul should have realized that he hadn't been fighting against David. Even from the get-go, he'd been fighting against the Most High God the entire time. And the Most High God had already delivered David from his hand 11 times, and now it's 12 times because of Saul's mental disturbance that he had. And he just was not about to give up on killing David. But Saul wasn't thinking along those lines. He wasn't thinking, well, David's the rightful king, and I know God's going to do this through David. Saul was thinking only of Saul and what he thought he had to gain with David dead. So Saul was out to kill David. When the Philistines were held back, guess where Saul was headed once again? He was headed to where David fled. And after Saul was called to return home, take care of the Philistine problem, he did. Then he was right back to chasing David again. Let's take a look. Sitting in the final verse of chapter 23, verse 29. And David went up thence from Maon and dwelt in the strongholds of En-gedi. That's over to the east, to the eastern side, right at the Red Sea there. And it came to pass when Saul was returned from following the Philistines, that it was told him, saying, Behold, David is in the wilderness of En-gedi. So David's on the move. David's on the run. So everywhere Saul goes, he finds out where David is, and he goes there immediately. You can see En-gedi there to the lower right of Adullam on the bottom of the map, on the David's flight from Saul map. It lies on the western side of the Dead Sea, also known as the Salt Sea. The strongholds at En-gedi are known as the Crags of the Ibex. If you look that up sometime and do some research, it's called the strongholds of En-gedi, and that was the Crags of the Ibex. Anyone know what the Ibex are? The Ibex are the wild goats that have lived in that area for centuries. The crags are the rocky cliffs where those wild goats roam. The word En-gedi literally means the spring of the kid or goat. There being numerous caves in that area, I'm sure David reasoned that area would be a good place to hide out. So that's exactly where David headed. Of course, we all know what was on Saul's mind when he learned that David had left Ziph and now he was in the wilderness of En-gedi. Saul went right back to chasing his son-in-law, as seen in verses 2 and 3 of chapter 24. Then Saul took 3,000 chosen men out of Israel. Evidently, he doesn't think he can do the job himself here. He's gathering 3,000 men. He's going to search David out. Saul meant business, and Saul went to seek David and his men upon the rocks of the wild goats. And he came to the sheepcotes. Those were flock enclosures in the area that were by the way where was a cave. And Saul went in to cover his feet. Now that was an expression in that day meaning to get some sleep. And David and his men remained in the sides of the cave. So who was inside that cave when Saul went in? None other than David and his men. They were in the rear of the cave. The word translated sides was taken from a Hebrew word meaning the rear or the recess of the cave. Today we'd say David and his men were in the innermost recess of that cave when Saul entered into the front. They were way back in the back, obviously being as quiet as they could possibly be so as not to give away their whereabouts, realizing that Saul had come in to get some sleep. He was tired out. Now, when you think about it, David was 30 years old when Israel chose to make him their king. He could have been somewhere in his mid to late 20s by the time this encounter with Saul took place. Saul called him a youth when he found David ready to encounter Goliath. So Saul wasn't a youth. He considered David a youth at that time. Saul would have been up in years. So Saul could have easily been in his mid-50s. He could have easily been in his 60s when this event at the En-gedi cave took place. Whatever the case, Saul was no spring rooster. Saul would have been tired out, I suppose. He's chasing David all this time and now on the crags of the rocks. You can imagine Saul's give out. He needs to go into that cave and get some rest. So when you consider he'd been chasing, all the chasing he had been doing of David, not to mention the conflict he'd just been in with the Philistines, you can imagine that he would have been a tired fellow by the time he arrived at the cave of En-gedi. Saul wanted to sleep, and sleep he did. He entered the cave alone, so this was obviously an opportune time for David to put an end to the nightmare flight that David had been undergoing. And he could do that once and for all right now. He had Saul asleep in a cave. In fact, his men, David's men, told him, do that very thing. Now's your opportunity to kill him. Now you can end this chase. Do you think that after all the attempts on his life by a mentally disturbed father-in-law obsessed with his death, that David was ready to eliminate his opposition? I think we can see that's not the case. You know what David did? He very stealthily approached the sleeping Saul, and he cut off the skirt of Saul's robe. The word translated skirt there meaning fringe of Saul's robe. Now, just as a quick point of interest here, let me show you what that might have been. For this, we have to make a quick trip back to the book of Numbers. Here we see God's instructions to Moses concerning the people. Speak unto the children of Israel, and bid them that they make them fringes in the borders of their garments. So now we might have an idea of what David cut off of Saul's garment. Speak to the children of Israel, Moses, that they make fringes in the borders of their garments throughout their generations, and that they put upon the fringe of the borders a riband of blue. Verse 39, and it, that ribbon, or we might say tassel, shall be unto you for a fringe, that ye may look at it, and remember all the commandments of the Lord, and do them, that ye seek not after your own heart, and your own eyes, after which ye used to go a-whoring. So here is Saul with this fringe that David cut off. Saul obviously wasn't looking to that fringe or even thinking about that fringe, but the garment the Jews wore in those days, and some continue to wear that same type of garment today. You can see those prayer garments they wear. It's called a tallit. It had 4 corners at the bottom with a tassel attached to each of the 4 corners. You can see that tassel hanging down. Many Jewish scholars believe that David cut one of those tassels from Saul's tallit. But this does give you some idea about what the fringe of his garment is all about. He didn't just walk up and cut a slice of his cloak. He cut the fringe. This helps explain why Saul would not have immediately caught that there was anything different about his clothing. He didn't go out and say, well, I've ripped my cloak here. He didn't even know what had happened until David pointed it out. And so he didn't know there was anything different. David pointed it out to him. This also explains why David was so sorrowful that he had to cut off that part of Saul's clothing. The part Saul was to be looking at to remember the Lord and to remember that they call it the prayer tallit. Plus there's a great picture here of what had happened to Saul. Those tassels, according to Numbers chapter 15, verse 39, the verse we just read, were to be constant reminders to the Israelites of the law that they had sworn themselves capable of upholding. That, as verse 39 stated, they seek not after their own hearts and their own eyes. And you see this symbolism there as David cut that off of his cloak? Because Saul had definitely not been using that as a reminder of not to seek after his own heart and follow his own choices there. What had Saul done? Saul had done that very thing. Saul had been seeking after his own heart and his own eyes. You see the picture God was presenting by David cutting off that portion of Saul's clothing? That tassel had ceased being the reminder that it was meant to be for Saul. And the cutting off of that tassel illustrates how far removed from Saul, that's how far removed Saul was from the law. Saul, being the king, Israel's king, the king that Israel had chosen for themselves, pictures the condition of the nation when it came to their fulfilling what they had sworn they could fulfill when it came to the law contract, the law of Moses. David ached in his heart. Chapter 24, verse 5 tells us, for having done what he had done in cutting that tassel from Saul's garment. So let's read verses 6 and 7 as we work our way toward the conclusion of 1 Samuel. 1 Samuel chapter 24, verses 6 and 7. And David said unto his men, the Lord forbid that I should do this thing unto my master, the Lord's anointed. David remembered how the Lord had Samuel anoint Saul to stretch forth mine hand against him. In other words, kill him, as his men had suggested, seeing he is the anointed of the Lord. So David stayed his servants, held them back from doing what they wanted to do, with these words, and suffered them not to rise against Saul. But Saul rose up out of the cave and went on his ways. Time to wake up. Saul's heading out in search of David again. He'd entered that cave alone, and he left that cave alone. But he hadn't gotten very far from that cave when David went after him, chased after him. This is where we see the sincere desire that David had to convince Saul that his his king, David's king, in David's mind, had no need to fear him at all. Saul's enemy had not been David, and David was trying to convince him of that. David had at no time ever entered into or entertained the thought of causing Saul any harm. Much less had David been searching for avenues to remove Saul from the throne. That wasn't on David's mind. That would have to be God's doing, which would come soon enough. David was honoring the man. I believe he sincerely loved his father-in-law. He certainly loved his son Jonathan, but I believe that David was honoring the man that God had formerly anointed as king over the people, and David honored that. The story continues with verse 8 there, chapter 24. David also arose after and went out of the cave and cried after Saul. Saul was apparently some distance from David at this point. David had to cry after him or yell out to him, saying, "My Lord the king." Notice how he directs it at him as his Lord, "My Lord the king." And when Saul looked behind him, David stooped with his face to the earth and bowed himself. Do you see that obeisance idea that we were showing you earlier on? And David said to Saul, "Wherefore hearest thou men's words?" Why are you listening to what men are saying? "Behold, David seeketh thy hurt." Those are ridiculous words he's telling his father-in-law here. Why are you listening to people who are saying, "I'm trying to harm you, my lord the king"? Verse 10, "Behold, this day thine eyes have seen how that the Lord hath delivered thee today into my hand in the cave. And some bade me kill thee, but mine eyes spared thee. And I said, I will not put forth mine hand against my Lord." Little L, of course, here. "For he is the Lord's anointed." He first addressed Saul as "my Lord the king," honoring his position. Then he says, "the Lord's anointed," honoring the position that the Lord had given Saul. But David went even further. He used a term of endearment here in verse 11. "Moreover," notice his change of direction, "my father." See how he's working his way inward there? It's "my father. See, yea, see the skirt of thy robe in my hand," meaning actually skirt translated from the word meaning fringe. "See the fringe of thy robe in my hand? For in that I cut off the skirt of thy robe and killed thee not. Know thou and see that there is neither evil nor transgression in my hand. And I have not sinned against you, Saul, yet thou huntest my soul to take it." You're out to kill me in spite of the fact that I could have killed you, and I certainly didn't do it. I never meant you any harm. David was in effect Saul's peace, and we'll see a type here of Christ a little later on. But David didn't stop there. He continued his effort to bring Saul back to his senses, as we see there in verses 14 and 15. "After whom is the king of Israel come out? Who are you chasing? After whom do you pursue? After a dead dog, after a flea." That would be a bit of humility, I would think. Talk about placing himself in subjection to the one he was honoring in a higher position. Talk about humbling oneself here. "The Lord therefore be judge, and judge between me and thee, and see and plead my cause, and deliver me out of thine hand." This story wouldn't be complete without a reading of Saul's response to the man that he'd been chasing down. Saul's response in the next 5 verses, 16 through 20, shows that he did regain his senses, at least for a time. We'll read straight through the section here, chapter 24, beginning with verse 16. "And it came to pass, when David had made an end of speaking these words unto Saul, that Saul said, Is this thy voice, my son David? And Saul lifted up his voice and wept." So now we have Saul realizing, however momentarily, he is my son here. "And he said to David, Thou art more righteous than I, for thou hast rewarded me good, whereas I have rewarded thee evil." Sounds like he's understanding some things here. "And thou hast showed this day how that thou hast dwelt well with me. For as much as when the Lord had delivered me into thine hand, you didn't kill me, David. For if a man find his enemy, will he let him go away? How could I be your enemy if you let me go away? Wherefore the Lord reward thee good, David, for that thou hast done unto me this day." Saul's next statement in verse 20 is a telling one indeed. Notice this one. "And now behold, I know well that thou shalt surely be king, and that the kingdom of Israel shall be established in thine hand." Now Saul makes his plea to David in verse 21, to which David gives his response in verse 22. So let's go to those 2 verses. "Swear now, therefore, David, swear unto me by the Lord that thou wilt not cut off my seed after me." Don't don't kill my offspring here, and that thou wilt not destroy my name out of my father's house. And David sware unto Saul. And Saul went home, but David and his men got them up unto the hold. They're going back to a cave. Now, I'm sure there are some out there who understand that we are not living under the law of Moses today, and that God's earthly program with Israel has been placed on hold, who may be questioning why we're going through the Old Testament portion of the Bible at all. Why bother, some would say, all these stories here, going through all these books? After all, Paul is our apostle, so why not just stay with Paul's epistles? We're not interested in Israel's program, some would say, or with their scriptures. Well, let me show these folks the reason we're conducting this journey through the Bible, and more particularly, that journey as it pertains to Israel's program and God's plan to repossess the earthly realm. Paul, our apostle, the apostle of the dispensation committed unto him, as he called it, the apostle of the Gentiles, gives us the reason why in the book of Romans, chapter 15, we need to go through the entire Bible and look at these stories. Listen to the words of your apostle, Paul, if you're following Paul as your apostle, in verses 4 through 6. Here it is, Romans 15, verse 4. For whatsoever things were written aforetime were written for our what? For our learning, that we through patience and comfort of the Scriptures might have hope. Those things were written aforetime were written for our learning, so that we might gain comfort. Having learned those Scriptures, Paul's telling us. Comfort in what way, some might ask. Well, did God turn his back on David, who believed God, even though David was a failure when it came to his flesh? Of course he didn't. The answer is no, not even for a New York second, much less a minute. David began as God's man, and David continued to be God's man, even through the failures of David's flesh. Not because David was perfect in performance, but because David believed God, as simple as that. David was a man who took God at his word. So we can learn from that, and we can take great comfort in the fact that it's not the performance of our flesh either. It's never been the performance of anyone's flesh. If these things written aforetime were written for our learning, then obviously God and Paul wanted us to learn them. Not that we might insert ourselves into God's plan to repossess the earthly realm, but that we of God's program concerning the heavenly realm might gain comfort in the faithfulness of the Most High God to accomplish his purpose through his people, no matter the dispensation at hand. So let's go continue to learn, because there are some failures of David's flesh yet to be revealed. Even through that, God's faithfulness to David would remain steadfast, because David was a man, again, who took God at his word. All right, we've just seen attempt number 13 fail in Saul's quest to put David to death. After this attempt and Saul's remorse, Saul returned home, and David and his men went back to the hold, as the Bible says it. That be the cave or the place of their hideout. This brings us to 1 Samuel chapter 25. That begins with the revelation of Samuel's death here, and where we see the story of David's marriage to Abigail, who'd been the wife of a man named Nabal before the Lord smote him, according to verse 38. So David's taking a wife here. He already had a wife in Michal, Saul's daughter, but as the story has it, Nabal had been unwilling to assist David's men, and David went to confront him, Nabal, taking matters into his own hands. So here we have David taking matters into his own hands. Abigail knew what was coming should those two men meet. So she went out to meet David and to plead that David not shed her husband's blood. Don't kill my husband. David agreed not to do so. Now notice his words in verses 32 and 33. And David said to Abigail, Blessed be the Lord God of Israel, which sent thee this day to meet me. And blessed be thy advice, and blessed be thou, which hast kept me this day from coming to shed blood, and from avenging myself with mine own hand. Do you see the education taking place here as David's beginning to know more and more that he's not to take matters into his own hand? David's ready to take matters into his own hands with Nabal. But it's plain to see that the Most High God was continuing to work on David's behalf. Nabal was soon dead. He would die very shortly after that. And David wouldn't be the one to bring that death about. But he hadn't forgotten about Abigail's kindness and her prophecy that David would become ruler over Israel. At the close of chapter 25, we're working our way ever closer to the end of 1 Samuel, we find David taking another wife, Ahinoam of Jezreel. So now, with Ahinoam of Jezreel, Abigail of Carmel, Michal, Saul's youngest daughter, David had 3 wives. We're going to learn that David eventually had 8 wives and some concubines, but Saul, true to custom, and in David's absence, gave David's wife Michal to another man to marry. So now he's got these wives, but one of them he doesn't have her yet. So once again, Saul could not get his bitterness for David out of his mind, even though he knew that the Lord was working on David's behalf, and in spite of the fact that he had told David in the cave at En-Gedi that he knew that David was going to be Israel's king. Saul was still not ready to let go of the reins, even after all that. Saul was going to hang on to his rule over Israel as long as he could possibly hang on to that rulership. And so even after that remorseful statement that he made at En-Gedi, I know you're going to be king, and I know the Lord's with you. And then he's after him again. Look at verses 2 through 4 in 1 Samuel 26. Then Saul arose and went down to the wilderness of Ziph. He's going back there, having 3,000 chosen men of Israel with him to seek David in the wilderness of Ziph. And Saul pitched in the hill of Hakilah, which is before Jeshimon, by the way. But David abode in the wilderness, and he saw that Saul came after him into the wilderness. David therefore sent out spies and understood that Saul was come in very deed. Saul's here. Now you'd think that this would have been enough to drive David out of his mind. That David would have been as crazy as his father-in-law by this point in time. At least that he'd want to put an end to what appeared to be what would have no end here. Yet we see something entirely different from David. Through David's spies, David learned where Saul had set up camp. David checked it out, and he found out where Saul slept. It wasn't inside a cave this time. So late one night, David and his relative, Abishai, went down to Saul's camp, where they found Saul asleep with his spear stuck in the ground near his head. This time, Abishai had some advice for David. Here it is in verse 8. Then said, let's just say it like it looks, Abishai to David, God hath delivered thine enemy into thy hand this day. So he's telling them the same thing that David's friends told him in the cave. Kill him, he's sleeping. Now therefore let me smite him. Abishai said, I'm going to kill him for you. Let me kill him, I pray thee, with a spear even to the earth at once. And I will not smite him the second time. I'm only going to do it once. Once is going to be enough. I'll do a good enough job the first time, but I'll not have to spear him a second time. He'll be dead on the spot. David's reply to Abishai is proof of David's graduation when it came to his understanding, not only the meaning of God's name, but also in his ability to rely upon God, to exercise the power resident in his name, and then sit back and wait for God to act. David's nearing that, walking across the stage to be handed his diploma. Watch David's reply beginning in verse 9. And David said to Abishai, destroy him not. For who can stretch forth his hand against the Lord's anointed and be guiltless? David said furthermore, as the Lord liveth, the Lord shall smite him, or his day shall come to die, or he shall descend into the battle and perish. However it's going to come, it's not going to come by my hand, David was saying. God will have to do it. His demise will be God's doing. Verse 11 continues the thought, and the Lord forbid that I should stretch forth mine hand against the Lord's anointed, but I pray thee, take thou now the spear that is at his bolster, meaning where he was resting his head, his pillow in a sense, and the cruse of water, take his canteen there, and let us go. So David took the spear and the cruse of water from Saul's bolster, and they gat them away, and no man saw it nor knew it, neither awaked, for they were all asleep, because a deep sleep from the Lord was fallen upon them. So he had every opportunity right there to put an end to this whole thing. Obviously, God was continuing to work on behalf of the man he had chosen to be Israel's king. And God is showing David that over and over again. David took Saul's spear, he took his flask of water, and he and Abishai went to the top of a hill above the camp. And David yelled out to Abner. Abner was, in a sense, Saul's bodyguard, waking not only the captain of Saul's army there, but also all the people who were with Saul. The whole camp woke up. No one in the camp was sleeping by that time. David's up on the hill and he's screaming at them. First thing David did was point to Abner's failure in verses 14 and 15. And David cried to the people and to Abner, the son of Ner, saying, answerest thou not, Abner? Then Abner answered and said, who art thou that criest to the king? And David said to Abner, Art not thou a valiant man, Abner? And who is like to thee in Israel? Wherefore then hast thou not kept thy lord the king? So he's accusing Abner of not looking after the king. For there came out one of the people in to destroy the king, thy lord. You see, Abner, being the captain of Saul's forces, would have also been acting as Saul's personal bodyguard. It was up to Abner to keep Saul safe. That was his primary responsibility. David was simply pointing out his failure in that regard. And why was he doing that? Well, he was doing that within earshot of Saul, so that Saul would know it wasn't his personal bodyguard that had protected him. It was David himself that had meant him no harm. Listen to his rebuke of Abner, a rebuke that David knew full well that Saul would be listening intently to as David was screaming it out. Verse 16, "This thing is not good that thou hast done, Abner. As the Lord liveth, ye are worthy to die, because ye have not kept your master, the Lord's anointed. And now see where the king's spear is, and the cruse of water that was at his bolster." When Abner saw that David was in possession of Saul's spear and his water, Abner knew that he had failed to keep Saul safe. But more importantly, so did Saul. Saul knew that it hadn't been Abner, it had been David that had spared his life. We see Saul's first reaction in verse 17. "And Saul knew David's voice and said, Is this thy voice? Here it is again, my son David. And David said, It is my voice, my lord, O king." David was well aware of Saul's mental instability. So once again, he tried to get Saul to listen to the voice of reason. Look with me at verses 18 and 20 here. "And he, David, said, Wherefore doth my Lord thus pursue after his servant? Why are you chasing me? For what have I done? What evil is in my hand? Now therefore let not my blood fall to the earth before the face of the Lord. For the king of Israel's come out to seek a flea, as when one doth hunt a partridge in the mountains. I'm a flea compared to you. Why are you chasing me?" Just as was the case at the cave of En-Gedi, David was steering Saul to re-examine his motives and to heed the voice of reason. Now notice Saul's response to David's entreaty in verses 21 through 25. "Then said Saul, I have sinned." "Oh, I reckon so," over and over and over again. "Return, my son David, for I will no more do thee harm, because my soul was precious in thine eyes this day. Behold, I have played the fool and have erred exceedingly." Then Saul said to David, "Blessed be thou, my son David. Thou shalt both do great things, and also shalt still prevail." So David went on his way, and Saul returned to his place. Even with Saul's apparent remorse, David knew his mental state. David knew that Saul could just as easily switch gears, turn on a dime in an instant of time, so to speak, and revert right back to his previous fear and loathing toward the one that who had at that moment called him son. So David didn't risk a return with his father-in-law. Instead, he went back to Gath. Now, it had been a long time since Saul was there last in Gath. And given Saul's constant pursuit of David, the king of Gath reasoned that Israel considered David an enemy. David remained at Gath for 16 months, the Bible tells us. But even during that time as an expatriate, so to speak, the Lord worked through David on behalf of his nation. David conducted raids against the Jeshurites, the Girzites, the Amalekites. So even while in exile, David was fighting the Lord's battles, and he was doing so on behalf of his nation. The Lord was exercising his name on behalf of the one he'd chosen to be over his nation. You can read about David's further pursuits in chapters 27 through 30, and I encourage you to do that on your own. You'll find that David was successful in every battle he entered during his time in Gath. The result wouldn't be the same for the king Israel had chosen for themselves, which was King Saul. When we come to chapter 31 now, the final chapter in the book of 1 Samuel, we find the Philistines in yet another conflict with Israel. Keep in mind that God had not been with Saul since he rejected Saul's kingship, and that had come earlier on, and anointed David. So God had not been with Saul. While David enjoyed victory in every conflict that David entered, the opposite would be true for Saul. Let's take a quick look at what was happening in this battle with Saul and the Philistines as we bring the book of Samuel, 1 Samuel, to a close. First two verses of chapter 31 give us the direction of the tide here. You'll catch it very quickly. "Now the Philistines fought against Israel, and the men of Israel fled from before the Philistines." So you can see that Saul's not having any victories here, and he fell down slain in Mount fell down slain in Mount Gilboa. The Israelites did, and the Philistines followed hard upon Saul and upon his sons, and the Philistines slew Jonathan and Abinadab and Malchishua, Saul's sons. So both of his sons are now dead. In fact, 3 sons are dead. Saul had been trying throughout the major part of his rulership over Israel to kill the one that he called son. Now he had to watch as his own 3 biological sons were slain by the Philistines. But what about Saul himself? Verses 3 and 4 give us more of the detail. And the battle went sore against Saul, and the archers hit him, and he was sore wounded of the archers. Then said Saul unto his armor-bearer, Draw thy sword, and thrust me through therewith, lest these uncircumcised come and thrust me through and abuse me. But his armor-bearer would not, for he was sore afraid. Therefore Saul took a sword and fell upon it. So Saul killed himself. We need to include the next 3 verses in order to get the full picture of Saul's sad story here. Verses 5 and 6 read, And when his armor-bearer saw that Saul was dead, he fell likewise upon his sword, and he died with him. This is going to be important information to have on our minds when we come to the book of 2 Samuel. Saul was dead. The armor-bearer saw that he was dead, and then the armor-bearer fell upon his own sword, and he died the same way Saul had died. So Saul died, and his 3 sons, and now his armor-bearer. And all his men that same day died together, according to the verse. David didn't have to kill Saul, and God didn't have to kill Saul. Saul took his own life. As the well-known proverbial statement would conclude, the chickens had come home to roost. So Saul had reaped what Saul had sown, and David had not even once turned on the man he honored as his king. David loved Saul, in spite of Saul treating David as his number 1 enemy. This will become even more obvious in our look at the book of 2 Samuel. So to bring 1 Samuel to a close, we find that when the Philistines came the next day to strip the bodies of the slain, they cut off Saul's head. They placed his armor in the temple of their false god, Ashtaroth. They certainly wanted to make a show of Israel's designated leader. They then took Saul's body. They fastened it to a wall in Bethshan, sending word throughout the land as to what they had done to Israel's king. This was a further humiliation of the man that Israel had chosen to be their king, the king that David had come to love dearly. So when the men of Jabesh Gilead heard the news of what the Philistines had done to Israel's king Saul and to his sons, they marched 10 miles to retrieve the bodies of those 4 men. They then burned the remains and buried them under a tamarisk tree at Jabesh, after which they fasted for 7 days. They were not going to give the people of the land an opportunity to ridicule Israel and her king. The Philistines would have no further opportunity to dishonor the bodies of Saul and his sons. Therefore, making a mockery of the nation King Saul had led, David would later commend those men of Jabesh for what they'd done. With that, we've come to the conclusion of the book of 1 Samuel. Now, I told you earlier we'd take a look at the number of the times, and we did attempt to do that last time just briefly, but is there a significance to those 14 attempts? Well, we also noted how those attempts on David's life prepared him for the role as Israel's rightful king. They were, in a very real sense, the education process that God was allowing David to undergo in order to prepare him for the throne that God had in mind for him all along. The throne to which God had Samuel anoint David while David was yet a youth. The throne upon which Jesus Christ will sit as king in the earth, king of the earth in time future. The question has been raised, as we started to point out in our previous session, is there a significance in the number 14 in connection with Saul's attempts on David's life? We talked a bit about it, but I want to expand upon it today. As I told you earlier, when God used numbers, he used them for a reason. Through the use of those particular numbers, God was able to convey certain symbolic concepts, such as the numbers involved with Israel's feast days. The seventh-day Sabbath is another example. The number 12 in connection with Israel's program. The number 70 in Daniel's prophecy of 70 weeks of years. The flood of Noah's day, covering a span of 40 days and 40 nights. And on it goes in the Bible. Those numbers repeat themselves in the Bible over and over again, showing that God was precise when it came to the numbers he used, and that those numbers have a symbolic significance. We know, looking at those numbers now, that God dealt with Israel according to times, signs, and seasons. So the times aspect is important. Everything's precise in Israel's program when it comes to these times. For instance, numerology scholars point out that the number 3 is often used in Scripture to symbolize completeness. They point to the fact that the Godhead is a, what? A Trinity. The book entitled The Trinity in the Universe, I think Nathan Wood wrote that book. Fascinating book explaining how the universe is comprised of threes. The number 3 is mentioned 523 times in the Bible. So there's a significance as to why God chose to use that particular number and that particular timing. For instance, there were 3 patriarchs of Israel, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Christ prayed 3 times in the garden before his arrest. How many days and nights did he spend in the tomb to complete, remember the completion, the payment for the sins of the world? The answer is 3 days and 3 nights. So you can see the idea of completeness. There were 3 gifts given by the Magi to the Christ child. Paul prayed 3 times, which completed his request to be delivered from the thorn in his flesh. In the book of the Revelation, God is described as a being which is, which was, which is to come, Revelation 1:4. To what place in the universe did God move his throne room when Lucifer's rebellion took place? To the 3rd heaven. And we could go on and on and on. The number 12 in the Bible is said to represent governmental order. That number again is used over and over in connection with the nation Israel. Jacob had 12 sons, resulting in the 12 tribes. Israel's given 12 apostles. There are 12 foundations to the wall of the city that will descend out of heaven from God. So it's a government. The 12 has to do with a governmental symbolism. 12 foundations to the wall of the city. 12 precious stones that garnish those foundations. 12 gates. At the 12 gates, 12 angels. The city itself will be 12,000 furlongs on a side. And so you can see Christ will be reigning on the throne, judging the 12 tribes of Israel. Was the number 12 important to God when it came to his program with the nation Israel and the theocracy that will be in place on the earth when Christ returns to rule over the world? Yes. Obviously, that number was very important. So we jumped from 3 to 12, but the number 7 is another significant number that God chose to use. Just as the number 12 is said to represent God's governmental order, the number 7 is said to represent not only completeness, like the number 3, but also perfection, whether physical or spiritual in Scripture. That number is used 735 times in the Bible. If we include the term seventh and sevenfold, that number jumps to 860 references to the number 7. Isn't that interesting? For instance, the word created is used 7 times in connection with God's creative work. On the 7th day, the Creator did what? He rested. So we have completeness and we have perfection in connection with redemptive creation. Israel's given 7 holy feast days. How many years did Jacob have to work for Rachel? 7 years. Later, when Jacob encountered Esau, he bowed himself to the ground 7 times before his brother. How many times was Joshua to march around Jericho? Do you see the significance to these numbers? Completion. The answer, 7 days, and on the 7th day they were to march around Jericho 7 times. So why not 5 or 6 or maybe 8? Why 7? Because it has symbolic significance in the Bible. It would take years of Sundays to go through all the 7s of Scripture and the symbolic significance attached to all those 7s that we see there. I think you can see how the case can be made that numbers have a symbolic meaning in the Word of God and why completeness and perfection are linked to that number 7 that we see in the Bible. The case has also been made, and I think we mentioned this, that a number doubled might very well stand for a double portion of what that original number stands for. That's the idea here. For instance, if 7 stands for the number of completion and perfection, then 2 7s, 7 plus 7, would be used to doubly highlight the fact of completion and perfection. At least this is how many scholars see it. Several books have been written on the numerology of Scripture. For example, how many years did Jacob work for Laban? Again, the answer is 7 years. But after the completion of those 7 years, he was deceived and was given Leah instead of Rachel. So he had to work an additional 7 years for Rachel, the wife of his true desire. So the sevens, 2 sevens, 7 plus 7, highlights the completeness and the spiritual perfection that God had in mind with the lesson he wanted Jacob to learn there in Haran with his father-in-law Laban. You see the case that can be made for God's use of numbers in connection with certain events in his word and why some are making that case? The question still remains. How many attempts did Saul make on David's life? 14 attempts that we can count. Did it take 14 attempts, 7 plus 7, to perfect David in the maturity that God knew David would need in order to properly be prepared spiritually to sit on the throne as God's chosen king? We could certainly make that case. Can that link be proven with absolute certainty? The answer is no. Of course it cannot. But we can certainly see the possibility and perhaps even the probability. Now, I don't know if this answers the question as to whether there's a significance to Saul's 14 attempts, but it's the best that I can do. You have to do further work on those numbers on your own. It's a very interesting study. The book of 1 Samuel, from chapter 16 through its conclusion in chapter 31, is about David's training and David's education, the education God knew that David would need in the meaning of his name in order for David to realize and appreciate the necessity of calling upon God's name and trusting in God to put his name into effect on David's behalf graciously. With that, we're now prepared to move into the 10th book of the Bible, the book of 2 Samuel. Now in 2 Samuel, we're going to see the reign of David as he is actually sitting on the throne, and how David's throne laid the groundwork for the kingdom to come in God's plan to repossess the earthly realm, the kingdom over which Jesus Christ will reign as king over the earth. In that sense, David was a picture, or as we might say, a type of Christ. Over and over we see that type. Let's take our remaining few minutes to talk about a few of those shadow pictures of Christ that we see in David. Pictures that God wants us to learn, according to Paul, when our apostle told us that things were written for our learning. How about David and Goliath? Does David's battle with Goliath not picture the battle Christ won on behalf of the world? Think about it. Christ died for Israel's sins, but according to the revelation of the mystery revealed through Paul, he became a ransom for all. Goliath was the worst enemy imaginable to David and to the nation as a whole in that day. Yet David faced him and came out victorious against him. Was Satan not a most formidable enemy for Jesus Christ to face? Yet Christ bested him. He faced him and bested him. There was only one representative for each side in David's battle with Goliath. David's victory was the nation's victory. Was Christ not the sole victor over Satan on behalf of the world? So you can see these pictures over and over again. David was sent by his father Jesse to the front line in Israel's conflict with the Philistines. Who sent Christ? We can see he was sent by his father to the front line in the world's conflict with sin. When David arrived at the battleground, he didn't get a lot of encouragement from his brothers, did he? You recall any of that? In fact, he was accused and ridiculed. We read earlier in 1 Samuel. Do you remember his brother's words in chapter 17, verse 28? Think back to those words for a moment. And Eliab, his eldest brother, heard when he spake unto the men, and Eliab's anger was kindled against David. And he said, Why camest thou down hither? And with whom hast thou left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know thy pride, the naughtiness of thine heart, for thou art come down that thou mightest see the battle. Obviously, David's brothers did not believe in him. I want you to notice this passage in the book of John, chapter 7, verse 5, speaking of Jesus Christ. I think you'll see the picture here. Neither did his brethren, John 7:5, believe in him. You see the types? They're all through these books. The parallels when it comes to David and Christ. Here's another interesting one. God had Samuel anoint David as king over Israel. Yet there was a time that came between God's recognition of David as the rightful king and when the nation Israel accepted him as their king. Does God the Father not recognize his son Jesus Christ to be the rightful king over the earth? Of course he does. The answer is obvious. But has the nation Israel accepted Jesus Christ as their Messiah, their rightful king? That answer is obvious as well. So we take it just a step further. Are the people of the world today accepting the risen, ascended Christ as the rightful king over the universe by accepting what Christ's Calvary cross work accomplished where their sins are concerned? When he died for their sins, was buried, having satisfied the justice of the Father for those sins, and rose again, so that those who believe in his successful payment where their sins are concerned could be joined to him? Apparently, here, obviously, the answer is no, they have not. So in our next lesson, we'll move on to David's inauguration as we actually take a closer look at Israel's interlude of blessing in the book of 2 Samuel, and then as we watch Israel merit the second bucket to fall on their heads, even as that interlude of blessing came to an end. Let's conclude this lesson right there. We'll pick it up here next Sunday, and we'll see David's inauguration and some interesting things as we'll see another covenant introduced here in the book of 2 Samuel.